and international experts and academics for this session of Week On to discuss the Caribbean's digital infrastructure gap and opportunities for the region. My name is Golda Lee Bruce, and I am a communication specialist with the Inter-American Development Bank. This afternoon, we'll begin with a presentation of the recently published IDB report that bears the same name as this event. It's called Digital Infrastructure and Development in the Caribbean. And then we'll move on to our panel discussion, followed by a Q&A forum with you, our attendees. And we welcome those of you joining us on YouTube as well as on Facebook. And we invite you to share your questions with us using the chat or the Q&A function wherever you are. So let's go ahead and get the ball rolling. We set the stage with a presentation from IDB Economics Lead Specialist Henry Mooney and IDB Sector Lead Specialist Connectivity, Markets and Finance Division, Antonio Garcia Zabayos. Welcome, Henry and Antonio.
Thank you very much, Golda. Let me just share my screen. We have a presentation. So please let me know if and when you can see it.
We can see it.
Fantastic. So thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank and my colleagues and other panelists. As Golda mentioned, the topic of conversation today is digital infrastructure development and how digital infrastructure can help countries in the Caribbean and more broadly in Latin America and the rest of the world develop faster. As Golda mentioned, what the basis for this presentation and most of the data that you'll see included here is research produced by the IDB that was recently published. This joint publication between departments of the IDB is part of a series, an ongoing series of research publications and ongoing research focused on ways that countries can overcome development challenges like this particular topic, but also many others, and ways that institutions like the Inter-American Development Bank can help countries overcome these challenges. We will only have about 10 minutes, so I will be brief, but we will share the presentation afterwards. So any of these particular data points can be reviewed later. So as I mentioned, what we're focused on is how we can accelerate development and inclusive growth across the Caribbean. Now, we're focusing in particular here on the 6 countries that are members of the IDB's Caribbean department, which are Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. But as you will see, there is data here that comes from the research that focuses on the rest of the region. Now, as backdrop for all of this work is really the growth performance of countries in the region, right? And as many of you who study the Caribbean or from the Caribbean or think about the Caribbean know, Caribbean countries have suffered from extreme volatility in terms of output, growth performance, and as a consequence, human development performance over the course of many decades now. So what's on the screen, without getting into too much detail, are averages for real GDP growth for the countries I mentioned, set against benchmarks of high, middle, low income countries and also other small economies, small states. Those are in blue and the Caribbean countries are in yellow. And without even mentioning the numbers, what you can see here is the extreme volatility decade over decade in terms of growth performance. Many countries in the region have suffered entire decades where the average growth is negative, if not very low, which is simply indicative of the challenge of trying to raise those growth levels sustainably for the region. What's on the screen now is the previous decade, the 2010s, where you can see in particular many countries in the region lagged considerably behind those averages for other income groups and small states across the world. And as we all know, what's on the screen now is growth performance in 2020, and that is in yellow, versus the worst growth performance in a single year going back to 1975. So to punctuate this history of volatile growth and relatively slow growth, we have 2020 because of COVID being one of the deepest shocks anywhere in the world, in the Caribbean, but in addition to that, sort of even deeper than historical shocks for a country, for a region that has been historically battered by considerable shocks. As you can see on the screen, and as you already know, many countries in the region suffered more than double-digit contractions in GDP in 2020. And this just sets the stage for sort of looking forward to how not only countries can recover from the COVID pandemic and this most recent shock, but thinking about policies, investments, and other kinds of actions that can help countries in the region grow more durably, more equally, and more predictably in the future. Now, we're talking about growth, which is ultimately one of the most important issues for development. And as we will show in the research, when we're trying to look through to why growth has been held back, we sort of reverted to first principles. So those of you in the audience who are economists will recognize this equation. It's a production function, it's output. But in very simple terms, without getting into too much detail, what this says is that any economy, Y is output, so your production ability, is really dependent on a couple of factors. One is capital, one is labor, and the other is productivity. So the efficiency with which capital and labor are able to work together to create output. So why do we focus on productivity? Because we think, it's not just us, research we've done, but other agencies as well, suggests that one of the key issues holding our countries back has been low, if not declining levels of productivity over the course of the last 50 years. So sort of mapping back to those growth graphs that we showed earlier, if you look at the trends in terms of total factor productivity, one of the most common measures, over the last 50 years, for many countries in the region, what I have shown on the screen are Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad, just because this data set is internally comparable. What you can see very clearly is that the level of productivity today, or at least at the most recent data that we have, is well below levels that prevailed in the 1970s, and that for most of this time, the trends have either been very volatile or in decline. Now, going back to the previous slide, the key to driving faster productivity growth is going to be not only to add more capital, but to make that capital work in a smarter way, and to use investment, including public and private investment, to drive sectors that have the potential to grow faster and add value, so high value added sectors that can compete globally. So this sets the stage for the next part of the presentation. I will turn the mic over to my colleague Antonio, who will talk about productivity and digital infrastructure specifically.
Thank you very much, Henry, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So as Henry was mentioning, it is clear that the pandemic has provoked a shock, not only in the demand, but also in the supply. And this shock has a perfect reflection in the existing gap of digital infrastructure. So if we can just move to the next slide, please. So what we can see in this slide is precisely that the Latin America and the Caribbean in particular are lagging behind in terms of digital infrastructure and connectivity, both in fixed and mobile broadband services. So particularly when we compare the situation of our region versus the OECD countries, we realize that there are double-digit gaps, and in some particular cases, what we are observing is that the gap in terms of fixed broadband is also quite big in comparison to the gap on mobile broadband. This is having an impact from two different angles and two different approaches. One is from the angle of the fixed broadband connectivity as such, which is going to be instrumental to reduce the exclusion, I would say, of social services such as the provision of e-school, e-education, e-health services, or any other public services that the governments are trying to provide. And second is also having a clear impact in the terms of quality of the services of the mobile broadband, and more importantly, in future applications related to 5G on key sectors of the economy. So we have here a double challenge. From one side, how to keep up with the level of investment both in fixed and mobile broadband, but second, how to get closer to the penetration rate of the OECD countries, keeping in mind the social and economic impact that this investment may have in the short and medium term. So we just move on to the next slide. This is exactly what we were trying to do with this research. We were trying to find out which is the impact that a $1 investment may have on macroeconomic variables such as GDP, such as productivity, such as direct employment creation, and also which eventually may be the impact in terms of social development. And what we just came up was quite surprising. So this is something that we already knew and we already experienced because of the pandemic situation. But the figures just speak by themselves. You know, we realize that those countries which are lagging behind in terms of the penetration rate of broadband services, they may have a catalytic effect coming from the investment on digital infrastructure and taking advantage precisely on the economies of scale that are coming as a consequence of improving the level of connectivity of the different locations and the different businesses. So we go to the next slide. What we can see here is precisely the multiplier. So what we are trying to understand when we were trying to understand what we are doing the publication is, okay, but let's compare what is the magnitude of the gap in terms of the percentage of the GDP, and what is the contribution to the GDP, to the actual GDP growth that an investment on digital infrastructure may have. And we observe the figures that you can see here, countries such as, Barbados or Trinidad and Tobago or Bahamas. We are talking about double-digit figures, showing the tremendous impact that digital infrastructure may have on economic growth and also may have on social development. But this is not just specifically for the Caribbean. So if we just have a look at the situation in all Latin America and the Caribbean, please, Henry, go to the next one. We observe that most of the countries are having different type of impacts depending first on the density of the population, second, depending on the existing level of infrastructure that is available, and third, on the particular policies and regulations that the governments are defining. In here, I would like to stress that it is not just about digital infrastructure, as I'm sure that the panel is going to be discussing right after, but it's also about having sound national connectivity plans. It's also about having sound policies and regulatory frameworks related to spectrum, related to infrastructure sharing, related to use of universal service fund. And also it is about digital skills. The sum of all those different variables are going to make a digital transformation really successful and, more importantly, sustainable for the whole society and for the economy of our region. So I stop it in here. I don't know, Henry, you want to complement a little bit, but that's all from our side. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, just before turning it back very briefly, as Antonio was saying, I mean, again, the point of this research and this work stream is not to be extremely precise to the second decimal place in terms of the specific, the exact benefits of the exact amount of investment for each particular country, but the research which is consistent with research produced elsewhere for our countries and many others suggests the same thing. But this particular area, digital telecommunications, and all of the businesses that rely on digital telecommunications, that the importance for economic activity and productivity is only going to increase over time. And in terms of potential investments a country could make, both public sector and private sector, we think that this is one of the areas that has the greatest potential benefit, the biggest bang for your buck, to put it another way. And what the research that we have suggests that the benefits could be many, many, many times the required investment. And in some cases, over the long term, those benefits could be in the double digits of GDP, comparable in many cases to some of the shocks that we have seen in the past. And lastly, as I said before, that this particular area will only become more important over time. So with that, I turn it back to the panel and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Antonio and Henry. We now move into our panel discussion, in which we'll have the opportunity to delve into what was presented to us a few moments ago. Please welcome our panelists for the discussion, Tomas Lamanauskas. He's the managing partner of Envision Associates and the candidate of Lithuania for Deputy Secretary General of the International Telecommunications Union. Gloria Henry joins us as well. She's the Vice President of the Port Authority of Jamaica And we have as our third panelist, Hopeton Dunn, Professor of Communications Policy and Digital Media at the University of Botswana. Henry and Antonio will also sit on this afternoon's panel. This session will be moderated by Lila Rao Graham, Executive Director of the Mona School of Business and Management. Please note that we'll be posting our event page, which has all of the panelists and speakers' full bios so that you can go and read their bios there. Once again, we want to remind you that we'll be fielding questions from you in a short time. So wherever you're joining us this afternoon, please put your questions into the chat and we'll try to feed them into the panel if there's sufficient time for that. Lila, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Golda. And I would also like to welcome everyone. What we want to do now is to allow the remaining panelists about 3 minutes, provide some initial comments as it relates to their area of expertise. And then after that, as Golda spoke to, we'll go into the panel discussion where you, the audience, can pose your questions. So Thomas, I would like to start with you. Given your wealth of experience working on issues related to the development of telecommunications sectors, can you talk a little bit about some of the key regulatory and policy issues that you have encountered, how these are relevant to Caribbean countries like Jamaica, and what advice you would give to Jamaican policymakers? Thanks.
So thank you very much, Lila, and thank you very much for this opportunity to join this panel and great presentation, hearing this great presentation from Antonio and Henry. Really very solid and strong case for investment in digital infrastructure, specifically in the Caribbean in this case, but everywhere. So now from my perspective, just a few pointers and hopefully leading to the discussion later on. So of course, as we already mentioned in this panel, the COVID really showed how important digital infrastructure and digital connectivity is, especially people further away or in the smaller places, and the islands in the Caribbean are a good example of that, how digital connectivity can bring the world closer and can actually allow the communities and economies to function in this times of pandemic. And not only economy, but also children to study. And it's interesting in this study to read that, exactly the example from Trinidad, like 65,000 of children were out of school in Trinidad. And that just resembles of the broader and not able to use remote participation. And that just resembles the broader issues around the world, like, 2/3 of the world's children and young people were unconnected in the period of distance learning over the pandemic, as per the statistics of international organizations. So we really see how important it is. Now, how do we actually make sure that we have more connectivity and we reach everyone? First of all, let's see with assessment what COVID-19 briefly did for our industry. And indeed, we kind of generally around the world, we were worried that COVID-19 will have a tremendous negative impact in the industry, but actually didn't have that big impact. Actually, in the beginning, industry saw some negative financial impact. However, it quickly stabilized, and more or less operators were back to the financial performance as ever. Now, the problem was that this financial performance as ever wasn't really great, because over the last few years already, decades, in a way, we haven't seen the great financial performance industry. So the question is also here, where do we take the money to invest? And that's, I saw the question in Q&As there. Now, however, the pandemic initially and for a couple of years, actually helped that investment case. And that investment case was helped because of the low interest rates, really a lot of stimulus funds and very volatile markets. Infrastructure was the place where a lot of investors wanted to invest, especially in Europe and North America, a little bit less elsewhere. We can talk later why it's a bit less elsewhere. But that's actually what's bringing in. Now, financial outlook is changing again. And with this financial outlook changing and interest rates rising, we'll see what impact that will be. Again, another topic and question to talk later. However, what we see next, what we see also coming out of this pandemic is really the big political case for digital infrastructure investment. And we see that, for example, United Nations Secretary General in our common agenda document, which now sets the, let's say, impetus of how to accelerate achievement of sustainable development goals, calls for reinforcing universal access to the internet as a human right with accelerated steps to connect the remaining people by 2030. So what we have pandemic, which showed how important the connectivity is. We have political will, and we have financial situation that is not great, but has given for the last 2 years a bit more impetus to invest. What the policymakers and regulators can do in this environment, and I'll touch here about some technical trends here to actually achieve, to help that connectivity to reach everyone. But here you have what they identify like as 7S, as just by coincidence, those S's. But first of all, so, the first S is for subsidization. So still see that because of such an importance of digital connectivity as now recognized as human right or utility, governments are pouring money into it. US is giving 65 billion for broadband. Europe says that 20% of 750 billion funds should be allocated to digital, including broadband. So governments are coming back, and we can talk a bit more how the governments in the Caribbean can come back. However, there are certain industry trends that regulators need to respond and probably positively help enable. Separation, so we see that industry is separating in different layers that helps attract different financial interests. So from, we have towers, we have wholesale networks, we have retail networks, we have neutral hosts, and this is this changing industry structure enables attracting funds, and we can again, think how the policymakers need to track that. The third is this softwareization. So the industry is becoming much more software-based, from open RAN to software-defined networks to cloud, to the role of cloud and infrastructure. That helps lower the costs, but also that sometimes faces some regulation that was, let's say, designed for the pre-cloud and pre-software environment, and that's probably may need to be revised. Sharing, the fourth SH, sharing is, of course, in order to reduce the costs, we see a lot of innovative ways to share the network deployments, from shared rural networks or for remote areas to again neutral host models and so on. The next test is spectrum. So of course, spectrum policy and enabling spectrum or releasing spectrum to industry remains as important. And we see that now a lot of that discussion with 5G networks, but also discussion on Wi-Fi, 6 GHz and so on. The one before, and then one before last is security, again in resilience. And that's again another discussion also, because we need to ensure that that networks really are resilient and secure, especially in the terms of natural disasters and so on, but also from a human impact. And the last is sustainability. So as we develop this all, we need to ensure that the cables, our industry doesn't contribute to the negative impacts of climate crisis and disasters, but actually helps overcome that. So I think this is like a little bit of a strategy on the infrastructure side, and again, 3 minutes is difficult to cover it all. The last bit which I want to leave with is also important, not just to focus on the infrastructure side. Just a report of GSMA released, I think it's yesterday, or maybe the day before yesterday, said that, look, so this 53% of the people around the world are now covered and connected with mobile broadband. However, what's the more important figure is that 41% are covered but not connected, and only 6% are not covered. So clearly, why we need to focus on developing additional infrastructure, and I have some pointers there that I just covered, we also need not to forget to focus from the policy side on the usage, from affordability to skills to content, and that's probably another topic for another panel. So sorry for the kind of my very quick rant on this. I hope to pick up on some of those pointers later in the discussion. Thank you, Lila.
Thanks, Thomas. And yes, I think in the discussion, we will have the opportunity to come back to expand on some of those points. So what we'll do now is move on to Gloria. Gloria, as president of the Business Process Industry Association of Jamaica, you work directly with operators in one of Jamaica's most promising and dynamic sectors. While all the sectors are crucially reliant on digital and telecommunications infrastructure, we could argue that the BPO sector is more dependent on current and future capacity than most. Based on your experience, how important is it for Jamaica to close the infrastructure gaps that the IDB has identified, and what would it mean for your sector? Gloria?
Hey, sorry, I was speaking with my microphone muted. Thank you very much, Lila, and good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, wherever else you are. It is absolutely fundamentally important for Jamaica to close the gaps for infrastructure and infrastructure development for this sector. We are heavily dependent on information and communications technologies to support the growth of this sector. And I would say COVID-19 has brought into sharp focus the need to have a diverse and strong, robust ICT infrastructure. Almost everyone became dependent on our infrastructure during the pandemic. Schools, public and private sector who moved to remote work, banks, food services who started using apps for delivery into different areas, all became dependent on this infrastructure. I would say 2022 is clearer now than ever before. The future is digital. Digital infrastructure is imperative to the development of the Jamaican economy, as everything is now being shifted to, the use of computers and the Internet of Things. And as Frost and Sullivan says that by 2026, approximately 65.96 billion IoT users will be around in the world. And I mean, we will have a fair share of those using that service within the BPO sector. So since June 2021, the sector has increased job creation by about 30% because we had a deceleration during the pandemic. And with approximately 50,000 persons employed in this sector, we are continuing our growth trajectory. The job increase continues. We're looking to move to about 100,000 within 5 years. And to support this kind of growth, we will need strong and robust infrastructure. As I said, GSS companies are connectivity based. They provide content and services through value chains and networks that all depend on infrastructure, whether it is to support hardware or the software. And in Jamaica, the main internet backbone and off-island fiber is owned by one provider, and there has not been significant investments. And I know Hopton can speak more about this than me, but we had investments after the liberalization of the telecom infrastructure in 1999, around about 2000, early 2000. But we have not seen any significant investments in those infrastructures since. And to be fair, I mean, the provider that now supports Jamaica has been very resilient and has worked very well with us within the GSS sector. And especially since the pandemic, where 80% of our workforce at one point in the midst of the pandemic was deployed remotely. Now we are somewhere between 30 and 40%. But for us to continue to grow and for us to continue to diversify and to support growth in knowledge process outsourcing and information technology outsourcing, the infrastructure needs to, the gaps rather, as identified by the IDB, those gaps need to close. There's considerable room, I would say, for improvement in the digital technologies and practices space. Some of those include policy changes that we think would be necessary to allow, cheaper and easier access to computers by Jamaicans. We have challenges with mobile connectivity, especially in certain communities where, connections are slow. We're having issues with latency and drop calls. So the importance of closing this gap cannot be overstated. And I'll just quickly say that we have seen significant investments in real estate to support this industry over the last 5 years, especially, where over $36 billion have been invested in infrastructure to drive the kind of growth that we are currently experiencing. But the mobile and digital and infrastructure have not kept abreast with that kind of growth. We've also seen significant improvements in investments in training and development through the support of the Inter-American Development Bank through what we call the Global Services Skills Project in Jamaica, which is working collaboratively with the Heart Trust NTA, JAMPRO, and the association to close the gap and create a demand-driven training system that is supporting our growth. But all of that depends on the quality and the capacity of our digital infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gloria, for those few words. And again, we'll have an opportunity to come back to those discussions. So finally, Hopeton, you have unparalleled knowledge and experience with communications policy issues, both in the context of Jamaica and other countries at similar levels of development in this region and across the world. If you could advise the government of Jamaica on 3 policy priorities to help drive innovation and investment in this sector, what would they be?
Great. Thank you very much, Lila, and greeting to my colleague panelists and the participants in this meeting, in this seminar. The first thing that I would advise the government is to fast track the comprehensive build out of the fiber optic network in the country. We are seeing a continuation of major gaps. Just last year, for example, it was announced that Jamaica needed something like 600,000 meters of fiber optic cables in order to build out the public sector infrastructure across the different parishes. That might even be an underestimate, because we need the fast tracking to help speed up quality and reliability for our schools, our businesses, our homes, as well as for community centers. And parallel with that would be the ongoing training in what we call effective access. So the first thing would be build out the network. Now that would require a collaboration between the public sector through the Universal Service Fund and the private sector. And one of the questions that we will have to ask is whether the existing private sector providers are willing, available, and able to provide this connectivity into the rest of the country, if we are going to develop in the way that we would like to. The second advice that I would give is that we need greater regulatory and business emphasis on the resiliency of the infrastructure and networks in order to protect against disaster scenarios as well as cyber threats. This is something that Thomas mentioned, and I think it is essential in a country like Jamaica. We have to create that 21st century AI-driven solutions-based network in order to help us use infrastructure not only as an auxiliary service, but also as a growing industry in itself that can provide productivity for our economy. The third thing that I would advise, Lila, would be in the area of helping to stimulate the cultural and creative industries. It's important, for example, that we fully embark on the nationwide broadcasting industry adoption of digital switchover. I know some leading players in Jamaica have actually embarked upon that process after a long spell, but it is a process that is underway. A process that I think needs not only to be fast-tracked, but to be made comprehensive across the different cultural service providers so that we have the ability to market our cultural industries on par with our colleagues and competitors elsewhere in the world. So the digital tools have to be sharpened in order to give us that high-end broadband and digital culture that I do not think we have as yet in place adequately in Jamaica. Those would be my observations.
Thank you so much, Hopeton. And thanks for all our panelists. I think you've given us some nuggets and very valuable nuggets that can now lead us into the open forum. As the chair, I'm going to take the privilege of asking one question to Antonio and Henry. And just because the general theme of this session is about infrastructure, and we've been focusing in terms of infrastructure on network and connectivity. But I wanted to ask the question, if if you think it's time to think about infrastructure a little differently. Now we have a lot of opportunities with digital public goods, big data for development. So there's a lot of open data opportunities. I think Thomas spoke to sharing. And so I'm asking if you think it's time to redefine the definition of what we're considering to be infrastructure.
Thank you.
Go first?
Sorry, go ahead, Henry.
You go.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Laila. You know, probably the simple answer to your question is yes, but we had to think about digital infrastructure not from the standpoint of just the digital infrastructure as such. We have to think about the digital infrastructure as a means to achieve the goal of a digital transformation for the entire society and the economy. To achieve that goal, we have to first bring into the equation the institutional framework. Second, we have to bring into the equation the regulatory framework. And third, and my colleague Henry was mentioning at the very end of the presentation, the collaboration between the public and the private side. So I think that pandemic situation has proven that private sector has been going to those areas that are economically and financially interesting and feasible, leaving those areas that are unconnected, still remaining unconnected. So there is definitely a public role into all this equation. And more importantly, there is a public role in bringing together the efforts from the private and the public side, not in an approach of competing one or another, but in the approach of complementing the efforts that the private sector is doing with a specific and strategic investment coming from the public side. So it is not just one decision whether to change the definition of digital infrastructure, but I will say it is more about defining how we overcome altogether the problem of having a lack of connectivity and digital infrastructure, keeping in mind that there are different stakeholders and there are different topics and areas that require our attention.
Thank you. Henry, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, just completely agreeing with everything that Antonio said. You know, as part of this research and other research that we are doing in parallel, I mean, we look at the history of capital deepening and development in countries that are at the high end of the spectrum, you know, the OECD advanced economies. And you know what you see very quickly in terms of investment is that, you know, in every country that has successfully lifted living standards and growth and income, the heavy lifting in terms of investment, as Antonio said, was done by the private sector, right? So we have to think, not only do we have to add digital infrastructure and digital skills and these kinds of things to the envelope of infrastructure, but we have to think differently. The government's role is important, but it has to be a catalytic role, right? Because, you know, at the end of the day, the whole point of this kind of infrastructure development is to drive the private sector, allow it to sort of innovate, to connect to other markets across the world. And that necessarily has to be a process where the private sector does the heavy lifting. That said, for reasons that Thomas also mentioned and Hopton mentioned and Gloria also mentioned, you know, things like the regulatory infrastructure, the way that, for example, you know, bandwidth is being auctioned, right, you know, property rights, all of these other issues that are very much in the control of the government have to be seen as part of the infrastructure development program. And the government has to be a catalyst as much as anything else.
Right, thanks again. So we have many questions from the audience, so I'll take them as I see listed. So we have a question from Gustavo. He's asking if the ROI is so high, why isn't the private sector involved? And again, Henry, do you want to take that?
I could take a first crack at it, and then I'll defer to
and then
Antonio.
Thomas also wants to say something on that. So go ahead,
Sure.
Henry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, right? And in fact, that ROI just keeps increasing every year, right? As the importance of the sector accelerates. As I was mentioning before, part of it is awareness, right? Part of it is also the sort of non-financial barriers that may or may not be in place in some countries that governments, for example, can help to alleviate. Again, regulatory, property rights, you know, all of the kind of policies required to unlock investment, there's a lot of heavy lifting that still needs to be done there, right? In terms of creating the business environment, investment environment, and also creating the financial capacity required to make these investments. So I think it's a great question, and I think it just highlights the point that a relatively modest amount of investment can be transformative in the region. But I will defer to my colleagues for.
Thank you, Henry. Just to complement a little bit on what you are mentioning, I think that what we need to understand as well is that behind the investment on digital infrastructure coming from the private sector, there is a profit and loss account. So keeping in mind that P&L, at the end of the day, the telecom operators and the sector are requesting first some sort of predictability in terms of the regulatory framework that is being put in place, having a clear idea where we are, but more importantly, where we want to be as a strategic action plan in one particular country, so that they can define exactly how the investment could take place and in which particular areas. So since at the end of the day, it is a matter of a profit and loss account for most of the private side, we need to complement those investments with a particular support coming from the public side in such a way that we can achieve those goals of universality in the same way as we were having discussion in the past about the electricity sector or energy sector, where anybody is complaining that it should be universal, and the government should somehow guarantee that it is going to remain universal. So I think that it's already time for the public side to help the private sector to make the internet access properly universal. But I think that Thomas probably wants to comment on this too. Thank you.
Yes, Thomas, you can go ahead.
Thank you very, very much, Laila and others from intervention. I will not surprise, but continue on what Antonio said and Henry already started. I think it's, first of all, private sector is investing. If you look around the world, the last few years saw a lot of investments from the private sector, especially in infrastructure. If you look at the fiber networks, if you look at towers builds out, there's a lot of private sector money from some people like private equity funds, infrastructure funds flowing there. To some countries more than others. And I think there's a couple of factors why some countries, first is of course a regulatory environment that, Antonio mentioned and Henry mentioned, is because generally what we talk, when we talk about returns for private sector, is always, we talk about risk-adjusted returns. So it's not only about the returns that you can get, but actually how much you'll actually get, in the end. And I think regulatory environment plays a big part of that, how predictable it is, how clear it is, and all that. But part of that now, we're starting to talk broaden regulatory environment, but what I call broader enabling environment. So broader macroeconomic environment in the countries that governments have influence on, how we, what's our, how prudent are our financial management of the countries, what impact that will be on interest rates and other fundamentals there, on how current, the world saw a lot of uncertainties with currencies in the last few years, So when again, if we talk especially about foreign investment, whether the investments will devalue because of currency exchanges and all that. But I think broader financial management of the countries and how the investment risk is managed is very important. And the last one I think is very pertinent to the Caribbean is the economies of scale. And I think is again, when you especially talk about investments from outside, it's also whether it's sufficient in economies of scale to attract private money. It's something that's funny. It's easiest in many times for private sector to raise hundreds of millions of dollars than hundreds of thousands of millions, and the current world. I know the world sounds strange. And that's why we also need to work, different players, governments, international development finance institutions and others to actually allow that private sector money to flow in a smaller, from one hand in a smaller projects, but on the other hand, most probably in the Caribbean, there's maybe the case of increasing those economies of scale. For example, and we have good examples in the Caribbean, we're having more harmonized regulatory and policy frameworks around the region, like building in the CARICOM single ICT space, and building on examples like OECS, ECTEL, example with integrated regulatory frameworks that enables those economies of scale. Is made much more attractive from private sector also to come in and invest in the region. So some of the views from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. We have a question for Robert Foster, and I'm going to pose that question to Hopetoun and Gloria. Is a concerted and coordinated Caribbean response intervention in ensuring the backbone in terms of cable networks? What are the investment possibilities? Gloria, you want to lead off on that?
Certainly, I think that there are possibilities, especially for us here in Jamaica. There are so many areas within the hinterlands outside of the towns and cities that are not reached, and where the services are either non-existent or they're very poor. So I think that, well, first we have to resolve the issue of providing greater broadband penetration, because we don't have a deep enough penetration in some of these communities, whether it is that we're going to use some other form of connectivity, but we need to ensure that we have the connectivity first. And then there is the need for the connections in these communities. So I think there is a great opportunity to invest in these communities. In Jamaica especially, I must say that I can't speak very widely for the rest of the Caribbean, but I know definitely for Jamaica, there is an opportunity there.
Thanks, Gloria. Hopetoun, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I want to respond in the context of the first question you raised about looking more broadly at the meaning of digital infrastructure. Because we are accustomed to looking at telecoms, and telecoms will remain a critical part of that infrastructure. But with the Internet of Things and the connectivity that we have right across our economies, we have to look at other forms of digital engagement in investment. We know, for example, that all over the world now, we are talking about digital roads, for example. We're talking about digital transport and road signaling systems where investments could come in, where we could be looking at not only utilizing the existing group of investors that have been in the economy for some time, but looking at inviting new prospects to see if they can open things up a bit. I did mention, for example, in the broadcasting sector, where we have a very small number of major players in an environment that is growing globally, where we talk about the virtual reality, we're talking about a whole range of things that can generate cultural economy resources. So these are some of the ways in which I think with a broader approach to the notion of infrastructure, we can invite wider investment right across the economy, not just in Jamaica, but in the whole Caribbean.
Thank you for that, Hopetoun. Our next question I'm going to take from one of our students, Blake Brown, our international economic student. How should developing states such as Jamaica, Barbados, and etc. position themselves for substantial FDI in broadband expansion? Does Antonio or Hopetoun?
Yes. Yes, I think if I may just make a quick response to that. Foreign direct investment in an economy, in the economies of the Caribbean, must rest on an assurance of a highly trained and mobile workforce. We need to create an environment where the educated graduates of our institutions are made more digitally literate and are themselves made to be engaged in investments within the economies of our countries. The involvement, for example, of network providers from Latin America, working with network providers in the Caribbean to help in building out that FDI in order to drive growth and productivity. I'm saying training, and I'm saying help with the creative economy.
Thanks, Hope Dunn. Gloria, I see your hand up, and then Antonio. Go ahead, Gloria.
Yes, I'd like to say that we can position FDI in, communication suites, mobile communication suites that are needed. And again, to support areas outside of the towns and cities, data centers. We need new players in those areas because we have a number of players, but we need new players. And as we build out, communities in the eastern end of the islands, and we go further into the south and come back to the west, there are needs in those areas that I believe that there are opportunities to develop mobile applications, to support, again, rural communities, because we believe in the rural communities behind in the digital space. And I think that there is untapped opportunities in those spaces that are available to attract FDIs. And even within the global services space, we currently have an 80-20 ratio of 80% BPO and 20% knowledge intensive services. There are great opportunities for our young graduates from tertiary institutions to be engaged in the development of mobile applications, in different solutions to support investors coming into Jamaica.
Thank you, Gloria. Antonio?
Thank you, Lala. There is one piece of a topic that I haven't listened so far, and I understand that it's going to be very important for that question, which is the topic on regional integration. So I think that when we are talking about the Caribbean countries, one thing that we have realized from the experience in some other parts around the world is that the countries cannot work alone in a digital environment, because precisely digital environment is pulling down the borders and is making all the society more interconnected. So to me, one of the key challenges that we are facing is how to improve international internet connectivity across the different countries, encouraging digital regional integration, and at the same time, making sure that all the countries are not only interconnected among themselves, but also are interconnected with around other regions around the world. In that particular regard, topics on submarine cables, but also topics on precisely what Gloria was mentioning on data centers, and more importantly, how to create regional hubs is something that we should, at the end of the day, bring into the equation. And here there is a lot of decision making, again, thinking as a strategic way where we want to be in a short period of time, and what is particularly the actions that we need to take as a region.
Thanks for that, Antonio. I think for me, this idea of a collaborative regional approach is critical. That's one of the things I feel very strongly about, the sharing of solutions, sharing of data and technology. So I think that's a very important input here. So I think, Thomas, we're going to pose this question to you. From time to time, we see these wonderful studies that highlight tremendous benefits to consumers, and then it dies at the government policy level. What can be done to push these through as quickly as possible? We know you have a great experience regionally, but also internationally. So can you take that question for us?
Thank you very much. And that's a great question. And I actually had some experience in some other islands, not only in the Caribbean, but in the Pacific, how we did that. And I think it's not only about the studies, but it's also how the studies are done, And I think that's great to see a panel here, where we see Gloria from the user's perspective, I can say, from digital infrastructure. And then we see people who kind of from investor perspective talking about infrastructure, and then, and matching those two different things. And I think the same way, the policy, it's very important that in policy making, research and analysis, we also already from very beginning integrate those different parts of the policy making that also not only allows them to understand realistically, what are the needs of the country, how we need to develop infrastructure, but also build already the platforms for implementation. sometimes if we look only from the infrastructure side, we'll focus too much, on the technology, what technology we'll deploy, what technology we need to kind of take, whether it's 5G or satellite and all that. But I think in reality, it's about what needs from the user perspective we need to implement, and then how those needs are best matched then from the technology solutions, and having everyone on the table is very important. And the very last important piece is, it's very important, this good mix, which we have today here in the panel, but we don't have over time, between what they call local expertise, international expertise, and international best practices. And I think a lot of those great studies, and definitely this is not one of them that we're talking today, but a lot of great studies are done from, consultants fly in, do it from international perspective, a couple of days of research and then, desk research, and then they bring into the government. And of course, these studies are supposed to gather the dust or be archived somewhere deep down in the files, So I think very important is, so what I'm probably my conclusion is, it's not about what we propose, but also how we orchestrate the digital development in the countries. And these ingredients are having a local mix with international, or having everyone sitting at the table, already from the very beginning, and understanding both user perspective and the provider perspective and financial perspective is crucial to actually get that advice implementable, and not only something to talk about.
Yes, thanks again, Thomas. And again, I think this issue of collaboration is reoccurring, right? That we need all the stakeholders involved in the discussions. I'm going to take the next question from one of our faculty, Christine Clark. What are the top 2 critical reasons why we are unable to close digital divides, and what recommendations can be made to at least halve the gap over the coming fiscal year? I'm not sure. Hopton, do you want to look at that? And then we'll get the perspective of IDB from Henry and Antonio.
Yes. The digital divide exists in a whole range of ways. One notable one across the Caribbean is rural-urban divide. Another one, income divide. So that the networks will need to be driven into the rural areas so that we can see our young people looking at farming as something viable and interesting because it involves technology as well. We need to look at how the digital divide can be changed to help transform inner city youth into creative and productive people through better expansion of these digital centers that they can go to learn and to practice. So those policy implementations will need to be implemented. And we also need to look at the digital divide on the gender basis, where a lot of our girl children are not seeing themselves or are not being seen as tech savvy potential contributors to this sector. And I think that training and that empowerment is going to be part of how we help to close that digital divide.
Yeah, thanks, Hopton. I think this issue of capacity building is key. I think discussions and studies show that capacity skills is one of the key reasons why people aren't adopting the internet. So it's not about just making it available, but making people comfortable to use it. Henry, do you want to add to Hopton's response?
Sure. The thought of closing the gap by half in the next fiscal year. When I heard the word fiscal year, it struck me that that's a very ambitious timeline, right? And I think we all need to step back and think about this in a holistic way. I mean, it would be great to close these gaps as quickly as possible. That's of course the objective. But in practical terms, especially coming out of a crisis, making that kind of progress in the very, very short term might be very difficult. That said, I think that there is, as Hopton mentioned and others before, this is not simply investment in technology and physical infrastructure. This has to be a whole ecosystem that's working at the same time. So I think you can make a lot of progress without necessarily focusing at the very beginning on the large financial outlays. And it's exactly what was said, making sure that the skills being developed in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean are the right kinds of skills to take advantage of digital technology, digital technology you have, and digital technology that hopefully you can catalyze in the future. It's making sure, as we were talking about before, all of the regulatory and other requirements to create the business environment that'll catalyze this kinds of investment are there. So I think there are lots of prongs to this approach, and if you measure it in terms of progress on all of the fronts that need to be attacked, I think that you can make a lot of progress in the near term. So, and that highlights the importance of something else that Antonio was mentioning here and elsewhere, that creating a holistic plan, a digital development plan, which is infrastructure investment, but everything that comes around it. I mean, that has to be one of the key early steps. And again, that's the kind of thing that international development partners like the IDB can help with. Other institutions as well, of course, it's not just the IDB, but I think that that's the first place to start. Just like governments put together plans for institutional development, put together plans for macro reform, I think this has to be approached in this way, and that itself is a huge, could represent huge progress, even if it's not the most expensive part of the investment envelope.
Thanks for that, Henry. Gloria, you wanted to add, and then Thomas?
Yes, I just want to add to what Antonio and Upton said. On the physical side, yes, we have to make devices more accessible, especially in rural areas. I mean, for instance, in Jamaica, we're still charging taxes on computers and telephones and so on. And those are some of the areas that I think a policy change needs to occur. In terms of competition, we also need to improve the competitive landscape in providing services here in Jamaica. We still are boxed into, certain challenges with the broadband infrastructure here in Jamaica. And I think that those are some of the areas that will need to change to allow for greater access and closing of the digital divide here.
Thank you, Gloria. Thomas, you wanted to add?
So very quickly, so exactly, like building on what Henry also said. So it's no, we need a holistic approach. It's no point of giving people cars if we don't have roads and if you don't have a system to give driver's licenses, So I think a lot of times with digital infrastructure, the old school approach was like that, to build and then see, hopefully it will be used. But all the time it's not, as we see with that so-called coverage, usage gap, where coverage is there, but usage is not there. However, one intervention that I came to really big believer on is connecting the schools. And I think that's where definitely, if you want a quick win, and I think always the bringing internet to ensuring that every school has broadband and every child can have an access to internet, that's really the intervention that both gives access now, gives a clear access to the content, so it has a clear usage because the children get content, and also build a good foundation for the future adopters and creators and future developers of the digital environment. So I think that will be probably one area for the quick win, but at the same time, while working for the bigger, broader, more holistic programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. We have to start wrapping up, so I'm going to take two more questions. I think one of the issues that hasn't been raised yet is the question of corruption and misapplication. So we have a question that says, how should investments infrastructure be protected against corruption and misapplication? Henry or Antonio, you want to give us a start? And then we'll take Hopton's perspective, or Thomas.
Well, I think that on this particular one, I would say that everything is pretty much related to the origin, as Thomas was mentioning. It's a matter of education. It's a matter of making the people understand what are the pros and cons of using digital infrastructure. And the same way as when we are driving a car, there are particular rules that we have to follow. The same should be applicable when we are talking about digital infrastructure. So I think that the whole discussion on cybersecurity is very much important when we are precisely talking about the generalization of digital infrastructure. but I would like to bring not only the cybersecurity, but more importantly, the protection of critical infrastructure and how to precisely establish this relationship between the public and the private side. So for that particular one, I think that having a specific regulation, but also having a specific coordination with the concrete protocols for the different sectors on how to avoid particular attacks or misuses of those particular networks is going to be very important. These days, in a society that is more connected than ever, it is as important as it is the infrastructure, it is the information that is passing through the infrastructure. And again, I think that it's very important to have people educated because what we are facing is a totally different approach as what we have been living in the past. And the pandemic again has teach us that we had to do it one way or another. You
know? Thank you so much, Antonio. Hopton?
Yes, so one way of looking at this is how do we manage better the incidence of cyber criminality, and how do we manage better the risk of corrupt officials in these industry operating entities and getting away with it, this business of impunity. Part of the issue for me is strengthening the regulators. I think we need to engage in a systematic process of continuing to train and strengthen our regulators. I also think that includes training and strengthening the law enforcement elements within the Caribbean regional law enforcement sectors. And then to carry out public education about reporting, whistleblowing, and managing cyber risks. I think it is a matter of criminality, it is a matter of illegality, and these have to be dealt with through both law enforcement, public education, and strengthening the regulatory bodies.
Thank you for that, Hopton. Does anybody else want to comment on this? Okay, so unfortunately, we have to start wrapping up. I mean, I think the number of unanswered questions still just demonstrates the interest and the importance of what we're discussing in the session. And I think it really calls for further dialogue in this area. But I want to close by asking each of you to make one remark. I'm going to put forward a question and I'll ask each of you to respond very briefly. If you had all the prime ministers of the Caribbean gathered and you could make a single statement on the importance of closing the digital infrastructure gap, what would it be? I'm just looking in the order the names are coming up. So Thomas, would you want to lead that?
Thank you very much. I think the study makes a powerful case. You know, if you really want to ensure region's development, if you want to ensure that your region plays an active role in the world, both economically and socially, but being integrated and having a voice in the world, you know, the digital connectivity is the only way forward there. But I think to achieve that, and I pick up on Antonio's point, it's really important to act as a region, and both in terms of regulatory frameworks, both in terms of economic space, but also, you know, uniting as a voice when we talk with investors, when we're talking with the private sector around the world to ensure that the region stands strong. So I think this would be my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Gloria, we'll have you next.
Yeah, I would agree with Thomas that the study is instructive for the regional leaders and for them to recognize and see the opportunity cost of investing in closing the infrastructure divide here in the region. And I would say that there are great opportunities for us to leverage our collaborative powers here in the region to get more FDIs, especially in, I have to speak for my sector, in the GSS sector, in shared services, where we can harness the opportunities to look at the various languages within the region that we can support. And, you know, once we fill the infrastructure gap, then we can look at those opportunities to bring more investments into the region.
Thank you, Gloria. Antonio?
Thank you, Laila. So basically, my statement will be that the digital infrastructure is not a cost, it's an investment, and it's an investment that is providing social and economic return in the short and medium term. So there is no time to wait, and it's time to start doing things. I will make a call for prioritization and a call for action. Thank you.
Thank you. Henry?
Yeah, I mean, very much along similar lines. I would say the future is digital. That will only become more important. And as Thomas, if you look at the study, but any other studies like it, though I think ours is more focused on the region than others. The potential return on investment is self-explanatory. Many order of magnitude larger return on investment than the investment itself. If an investment like that was put to you personally, you would do it in a heartbeat. So I think that would be the message.
And thank you. And finally, Hopta?
Yes, thank you. I will start with the human infrastructure, the human side, and I would say digital literacy, and the governments should be led to drive from their own perspective by making the public sector employees digitally literate. And in the course of doing that, I would parallel that with increased digital infrastructure build out led by the private sector. That would be the advice that I would give.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those comments. And we're at the point now where we have to close. I want to thank Antonio and Henry, and I want to really, really ask or suggest that everybody goes and reads this report. I think it's a very important one, and the idea that it has been quantified, through the multiplier values, it really brings home the impact of these investments. So I think it's a must read for everyone, and we want to thank you for that report. And personally, my bias, I think the idea of a regional, collaborative, holistic approach to address these gaps is what we need to leave here with, because it really requires the discussion at all levels. And I think this panel just demonstrates the importance of having all players involved in the discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand back over. Golda.
Thank you so much, Lila, and thank you for your expert moderation of our panel this afternoon. Thank you, Hopeton, Gloria, Antonio, Henry, and Tomas for making the time to be here. We had many questions, more than we could answer in the time. We'll be following up tomorrow, sharing the report with you once again. And a couple of you also asked for the video of this event. It's already available on the Inter-American Development Bank's Facebook channel, as well as on our YouTube. So you can find it there immediately. On behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank and the University of the West Indies Department of Economics, thank you so much for being a part of WeCon 2022, and in particular, this important discussion on digital infrastructure and development in the Caribbean. Thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you too. Bye-bye. Thank you, fellow panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leela.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Yes, nice to see you. We'll be in touch. Yes, all the best to you as well.
Okay.
Thanks again, everyone. It was really well. It was really great. Thank you.